Hey, hello, my name's Sophie Heywood and I'm from the University of Reading in the UK. And today I'm going to be talking about the Little Red Schoolbook from 1969 and schools activism in Europe, and asking about what's this, empowering children to speak out. So the kind of historical question, the kind of idea behind this paper is to have a think about how adult attempts to mediate, to kind of facilitate children speaking out, how they work, what kind of motivations might be there, and what problems that this kind of activism can encounter, and kind of power relations. How does it work, essentially? And the example I'm going to use is quite a sort of notorious example of such adult activism to empower children, which is this publication on the left-hand side, the Little Red Schoolbook, written by a couple of Danish school teachers and a school psychologist in 1969. So it's a publication from the era that dates from the era the French called the 68 years, which were characterised by protests and countercultural turbulence that kind of stretched before and after the pivotal year of 1968. So from a children's history perspective, I think it's an interesting period. We're kind of perhaps familiar with the cliche of May 68, or 68 as being a kind of a youth quake. But it's also interesting because I think, particularly for children, for young people, it's a period when the boundaries of childhood, which had been extending over the course of the 20th century with the kind of extension of the school, lengthening of the school leaving age, expansion of university education, and the removal of children from the workplace, really. The implications of this longer period of dependency for the young people who found themselves in this extended childhood led them now to kind of challenge some of the legal and social structures that shaped their lives, and the boundaries of childhood itself. And I'm going to argue that the book's authors were seeking to aid in that process. We're going to be asking them kind of how helpful this was, and how sincere the desire to help was. I should briefly say that much of the material in this paper comes from an article that I wrote with my colleague Helle Strandgaard Jensen. You can see it on the left-hand side there. We worked together on a project on children's culture in '68, and I just wanted to underscore that I don't read Danish. So I'll try to make it clear where ideas and materials come from Helle's research and our discussions together. Okay, so my first kind of introductory point then, just to kind of provide you with the context to understand, the student protesters who played a prominent role in the kind of turbulence of the period, for the purposes of this paper, I understand them as people who were legally considered to be children at the time, and who were in the process of trying to change the definitions of childhood and challenge the power structures between the power relations, the government relations between adults and children, and those power relations that structured their lives. So primarily it is in terms of the vote. Under 21, many children, people under 21 around this time in Europe don't have the vote. And that's a point that's made quite strongly in their posters. So, for example, you can see a couple of famous examples there. An integral part of the student struggle, I think, against the state was against infantilization, their lack of voice, the restrictions placed on their sexuality, and not being allowed to vote. But it is also about political voice as well. And the other point I wanted to make as well is that that these people who are legally children, that could stretch quite far. The politicization, the kind of involvement in the events, and that sort of rights claiming that was going on around '68 did involve much younger groups as well. So the school children, high school children in France, lycée is a high school or secondary school, they go on solidarity strikes with the students in May, and they organise themselves in comités d'action lycéens, so schools action committees, which had developed slightly earlier out of protest against the Vietnam War, but here they really come into their own. And because in so organising, going on strike, holding meetings, talking, they develop a manifesto for rights claiming for themselves, understanding the changes they want to see, and their status as children, what rights that deprives them of, and the deprivation of voice. So here, just after May 68, they published a book, their kind of cahier de doléances, their demands, and it's called "They Have the Voice." They take the parole. Sorry, I'll be quick. And it also inspires in England as well the English Schools Action Union that's set up in April 69, and you can see on the left-hand side their manifesto. But children were by no means the only ones seeking to transform schools and education. So this is where we come back to my kind of the main subject, I guess, really, is the relationship between these two very much linked but separate movements, is adults' desire to kind of challenge those children's status in society, transform in particular schools and education. It's interesting, the critiques of mass education system adopt this new language of rights that is part of this kind of liberationist interpretation of children's rights activism, in opposition to what we could see as a kind of protectionist approach. I'm following Michael Grossberg's framework here. That's the kind of development product, I think, of the sheltered childhood that develops in the 20th century as an ideal. And so how the kind of adult desire to kind of reform things, to give rights to children, and the children's activism, how that they necessarily merge, but it could be problematic. So in the case of the Children's Rights Workshop in the UK, their stance on sex led to acceptance of a paedophile network, famously. And so now I'm going to think about this example, the Danish Little Red Schoolbook from 1969, and I'd like to focus particularly on its kind of question of the problems of political agency, so kind of the non-citizen aspect of children in this period, and their kind of challenging of that, claiming those rights, and how it still nevertheless gets tangled up in the question of sex education as well, which is integral to that kind of challenging of the boundaries of childhood. So here, the Danish Little Red Schoolbook, as I said, it was written by two teachers, Bo Dan Andersen and Søren Hansen, and the school psychologist Jesper Jensen. And the idea behind the book was to speak directly to children and to bypass traditional adult gatekeepers in children's lives, such as parents and educators, by providing children with information on social structures and mores that shape their lives, such as the school system, but also the kind of the democratic structures, but also in terms of the mores that shape their lives, questions of sex, education, and drugs. And it's written very much from a kind of harm reduction approach. And there's an article by David Limond on that that's interesting. But fundamentally, the idea is to give children the tools to claim their rights. And so 3 out of the book's 5 sections were dedicated to explain to school pupils, so I'm going to use the word pupil as in contrast to students so we don't get confused, pupils, how the education system worked, and so how they could go about changing it. So it details to pupils how to make complaints against teachers, what sort of evidence they would need to collect, who the relevant authorities were, and even provided them with a template letter for lodging an official complaint. The other 2 sections then focused on informing children about sex and drugs to address the lack of adequate education on these topics available to the young. And they wrote candidly and without judgment on topics such as pornography, female sexuality, male sexuality, homosexuality, and provided, primarily it's about providing kind of information to combat disinformation on things like masturbation, but also, you know, where to seek solidarity, for example, if you're gay, or help if you're a girl. So they provide things like contact details for the gay liberation movement or similar organisations, and explain to girls what their rights were when dealing with the medical profession if they're seeking contraception or abortion. But what I'd like to do above all, is talk about its packaging just now in this kind of explaining it to you, because I think it's an important aspect about it. It is, and it brings me back to my kind of original question about the interaction between adults and children in this kind of desire to help children speak out and claim their rights. Because what they're trying to do is to speak to school children aged 10 and above. They design it to appeal to young 68ers. So they kind of try to adopt the symbols and language of the 68 protests. So, you know, it's little and it's red. It's like the kind of Mao's Little Red Book that students were kind of holding aloft on campuses across the West. And that impression is further kind of reinforced by its opening salvo, all grown-ups are paper tigers. So. And also the way it was written, it was very much aimed at reaching, at being accessible to young readers. And it's used very frank language, such as fuck, for example. You know, its detractors kind of called this the language of the playground, but that was basically what they were trying to do, not use obfuscating language or biological language that might be unfamiliar. They tried to use language that was, you know, coarse, but very much kind of commonly used, or perhaps not commonly used, but, you know, that children could probably be relied upon to be familiar with. But when writing this article together, my co-author Hella and I, we discussed how, you know, how in producing a little red book for children, using kind of quite coarse, shocking language, it's about provoking a violent reaction. And perhaps just as much about provoking a violent reaction as it is about providing a toolkit for resistance, i.e. for children. Hella pointed out, you know, that they're members of the Danish grouping of the Dutch countercultural Provo movement, which was all about provocation, you know, using non-violent, playful, absurd, shocking methods to kind of provoke the authorities, provoke them into revealing their truly fascistic nature. You know, so Hella noticed through her research that the authors seemed really desperate to provoke a scandal. So they circulated all these rumours before the book was published. For example, suggesting that in the section on school that they advised children, if you want to get rid of a teacher, you know, here's a letter you can write, here's a template, or just sleep with him. And then he'll definitely lose his job. And, you know, there were rumours about typesetters refusing to print this and walking out. What's interesting is nothing. It's really the published version does not contain stuff like that. There's nothing saying sleep with your teacher, and in fact, the kind of the Jutland press, that the Jutland Post, sorry, when they got a hold of the actual published version, was really quite disappointed. It's like, oh God, this is really boring and moralistic. You know, certainly compared to what they'd been kind of promised. Does tell you a little bit about what was considered acceptable in Danish children's culture around 68. But, and I'm going to end my final bit of this talk, is going to look at actually separating the book from its authors and their antics and their kind of, well, as much as it's possible, to thinking about the book itself, and how it travels, what happens and what we can kind of see, because it does get picked up as useful by school pupil activists and by leftist publishers often aligned to the student movement. So it does seem to have kind of struck a chord, and it does seem to have spoken to its audience, which is interesting. And there are 2 points that are going to structure this that I'm going to make in this final part. First of all, that the project really needed the participation of child activists to make it work. It wasn't this kind of, yes, they could shock, and that provoking debates and so forth was important, but you can't do that without child activists. It doesn't work. So they are integral to, they're needed to validate it, but also to distribute it, to make sure it gets to the readership, which generates the buzz, the scandal that they needed. So we're going to focus on the English translation now, which is published by Stage 1 Publications, because education is the first stage of revolution. And you can see on the right-hand side there the kind of publisher that we're dealing with, very much of its age, of the counterculture. The publisher, what's interesting is he assembles a team of 2 young teachers and 3 pupils from Holland Park Comprehensive School, where a lot of activism was going on. And they work together to go through the text, the translation of the Danish text line by line, to make it speak to British problems, to the concerns, especially the concerns of young people, ensure that children had the information they needed. And interestingly, this team also kind of decided that the Danish text had placed too much emphasis on the divisions between children and adults. Here they kind of try and soften it to show that the children can have allies and will need allies, and because their emphasis is really on helping those who need it. As one of the teachers, one of the pupils gave an interview to the Times Educational Supplement, and they say, what we care about most is making sure this book gets into the hands of those who it could most help. And this is where the pupils come in again for distribution, to make sure it does get to those who need it, in their view. And so that includes the Schools Action Union, who were enlisted to distribute free copies. But, and as you can see from the title of this article, the question of scandal and the kind of provocation remains integral to the project. But how useful is it then if this is all about reaching the children that need to be reached? Because by the time the book makes it to England, it was already really notorious, having been subject to all sorts of restrictions and bans. And, the Times Educational Supplement describes it here as a midget with a mighty kick, that was likely to cause controversy out of all proportion to its size, if one can judge by the reception of similar editions in other European countries. And so, of course, when news that there was going to be an English translation of this book that was about to be published circulated, well, then that kind of galvanizes people, and particularly the morality campaigner Mary Whitehouse called for the Director of Public Prosecutions to act. And under the Obscene Publications Act, police went to search the publisher's premises twice, and they seized copies of the book. And so it goes to trial. And she's got it under the Obscene Publications Act. So the sex education bits were really, it's interesting, in France it gets banned because it's seen as, seditious and going to cause a revolution. Here in the UK, it's the sex education bits that really kind of bring it to the fore. And basically the school book then becomes a protagonist at the peak in the kind of conflicts that come in the early 70s between the defenders of the moral order and the counterculture of the 68 years. So it goes to trial in the summer of 1971, which basically places the school book in the dock at exactly the same time as the infamous underground magazine Oz. Their School Kids issue was also on trial for obscenity. Interestingly, members of the Schools Action Union had also been involved in writing that, and also Children's Rights Workshop. But it is much less kind of serious-minded than the school book, it should be said, and does include pornographic imagery. The School Kids Oz. So there's a lot of differences between the two publications. And John Mortimer, who's the QC for both of them, famous defender of freedom of speech, kind of regretted, I think later, that they'd been kind of placed at the dock at the same time and kind of placed in comparison with each other. But the smutty details of both trials really caught the imagination of the press. And they get caught up in the media circus that you can see here on the left-hand side. Oz magazine is really trying to kind of generate. And so that combination of sex and the tender age of their target readership made the two publications particularly controversial and particularly vulnerable here. So you can see the guilty Red Schoolbook and so forth. And Mary Whitehouse observed, "We can be grateful to the publishers of the Little Red Schoolbook for one thing. They've demonstrated in no uncertain terms just how vulnerable are the young at the hands of those who preach freedom but advocate license." So the kind of children speaking out get kind of then caught up actually through the kind of more scandalous elements of the sex education bit. They get caught up in this. It kind of gives ammunition to her. I'm just going to end then with the kind of the epilogue, what goes on. Richard Handyside, who's the director of Stage 1 Publications, sought to appeal the obscenity judgment against the schoolbook. And he took his case to the European Court of Human Rights in 1976. What's interesting here is the European Court rules that each state, they uphold the English court's decision. And more than that, they decide that every state has the right to decide for itself within certain limits on the moral protection of its citizens, particularly cases such as this, and child protection or religious morality. And this was one of the court's most important decisions, for it set a precedent that has been used many times since in freedom of speech cases dealing with protection of morals or religious sensibility. And you can see here, it's a really interesting decision from the Court of European Human Rights, just as also a kind of reflection on the kind of place of children within the kind of struggle between the counterculture and the sort of moral order, the forces of tradition. And in particular, you know, the judgment was really kind of underscored how important it was that the intended readership of the school book was so young. And it could be seen as an incitement to them to kind of indulge in activities that might be harmful or even commit certain criminal offences. But I would underscore as well, you know, they found numerous passages that were subversive, not only to authority, but also to the influence of trust between children and teachers. So this adult attempt then at facilitating children's agency, in the end, we could argue really kind of hampered it, because we end up with this, it gives ammunition to people like Mary Whitehouse, to those arguing for protectionism, and you know, ends up in this judgment, court decision that makes much more clear and the importance of child protection as being one of the key restrictions on freedom of speech. But I think I would also end on the idea that it's interesting, because I think it shows how far the students and school pupils here, their activism and their acts of rights claiming had constituted them as political actors of import. You know, essentially to make this kind of point, to force debate on education and corporal punishment and young people's right to sex education. The authors and campaigners here felt it was important to speak to this audience, to adopt their language. But more than that, they need them, they need their support, they need their involvement to legitimate the whole project. So that, I think, is an interesting point to end on. Okay, thank you very much.